Imagine this. It's 1940, and you're standing in your own backyard in the fading light of evening. The roses your mother once tended are still there, the soil dark and damp. But tonight you are not planting flowers. Tonight you're digging. With every shovelful of earth, you and your neighbors carve a pit into the garden, not for crops, but for survival. The war in the skies has reached your doorstep, and your family's safety will depend on a half-buried hut of corrugated steel, hammered into place with your own hands. This was the reality for millions of ordinary Britons during the Blitz. The German Luftwaffe rained destruction on cities night after night, and civilians had to adapt in ways that no government plan could fully prepare them for. The most iconic adaptation was the Anderson shelter, a simple corrugated steel structure that turned gardens into fortresses. And at the center of this story stands Sir John Anderson, the man whose name became synonymous with survival. As Home Secretary, Anderson oversaw Britain's civil defense, and his solution was clear. Protect the people not in massive government bunkers, but in their very own gardens. But the true story of the Anderson shelter is not only about one man. It is about the countless civilians, fathers, mothers, neighbors, and children who transformed sheets of steel into homes beneath the earth. It is their sweat, their fear, and their determination that gave these shelters meaning. By the summer of 1940, Britain braced for invasion. Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe, and now its bombers turned west, targeting ports, factories, and the heart of British cities. The Blitz was not a single raid, but a campaign. 57 consecutive nights of bombing, thousands of tons of explosives, and entire districts reduced to rubble. In London alone, tens of thousands would die. In industrial towns like Coventry, Birmingham, and Liverpool, devastation was near total. Ordinary citizens had to ask themselves the same question: where will we hide? The government had prepared large public shelters, underground stations, and even reinforced basements. But Sir John Anderson believed the key to civilian survival was something smaller, more intimate. Shelters that could be built in gardens at the very edge of home. In 1938, as war loomed on the horizon, the government commissioned engineers William Patterson and Oscar Kerrison to design a low-cost air raid shelter. The goal was simple. It had to be cheap, easy to mass-produce, and strong enough to withstand a nearby bomb blast. Their answer was as unglamorous as it was ingenious. 6 curved sheets of corrugated steel bolted together to form an arch. 2 flat sheets for the ends. Half buried in a pit, covered with a layer of soil, the structure became part of the earth itself. The shelter was designed to house 6 people. It had no luxuries, no lighting, no heating, no furniture provided. It was a shell, nothing more. But it worked. Tests showed that when properly installed, an Anderson shelter could withstand the shockwave of nearby explosions, collapsing walls above while leaving those inside alive. In February 1939, months before the outbreak of war, the first Anderson shelters were distributed. By September, as Britain declared war on Germany, more than 1 million households had received them, but the government had not built them. The families themselves did. To receive an Anderson shelter, a family had to do the work. Steel sheets arrived on lorries, delivered in bundles. Instructions were printed on leaflets. Dig a hole 6 feet deep, bolt the panels together, cover with soil. It was a communal act of construction. Neighbors helped neighbors. Children carried buckets of earth. Men worked with shovels and spades late into the night. For many, it was the first physical proof that war had truly come home. Imagine a quiet suburban street in September 1939. Lawns turned into piles of mud, fences taken down to make space, entire rows of houses sprouting strange half-buried huts like metallic mushrooms. The tidy order of English gardens gave way to a landscape of miniature fortresses. Some households improvised. They lined walls with sandbags, reinforced doors with wooden planks. or even planted flowers atop the soil roof to disguise the structure. One diary from a London mother recalls, "Our garden is now a battlefield of mud. The boys play soldiers around the hole, but I cannot help but think it will one day save them." Not everyone welcomed the shelters. Critics argued that the Anderson was uncomfortable, damp and impractical. Buried in the earth, it often flooded in heavy rains. Families complained of cold, of cramped space, of waking to find worms crawling along the walls. Others doubted whether a thin arch of steel could really stop a German bomb. Newspapers published photos of test shelters half buried in rubble, with mannequins seated inside. The message was clear: these shelters worked. Yet for many, trust came only with use, when the first bombs fell and the shelters were put to the test. Still, by the start of the Blitz in September 1940, over 2 million Anderson shelters had been installed across Britain. For poorer families, they were issued free. For those with higher incomes, they cost £7 each. In all cases, they represented something rare in wartime: personal control over survival. When the Luftwaffe began its relentless assault on London, civilians turned to their shelters. Families huddled underground, listening to the sirens and the thump of distant bombs. Inside, the shelters were furnished with whatever could be spared: camp beds, blankets, kerosene lamps. Some brought in wireless radios to pass the long hours. The atmosphere was tense, but oddly domestic. A child's toy on the floor, a kettle perched on a makeshift stove, a mother knitting by lamplight while her husband read the newspaper, trying not to flinch at the sound of anti-aircraft guns. One survivor later recalled, "It was as if our life had split into two halves, the daylight world above and the underground world below. We laughed, we argued, we slept, but always with the sound of war above us." By the autumn of 1940, the Anderson shelter had become as much a symbol of the Blitz as barrage balloons or searchlights. Photographs of families smiling in front of their shelters appeared in newspapers, part propaganda, part defiance. Sir John Anderson himself rarely sought credit. His role was administrative, yet his name was carried by every one of those curved steel huts. For civilians, the shelter was not just a government program. It was their contribution, their construction, their defense. The story of the Anderson shelter is thus a story of partnership, a government that designed and distributed, and a people who dug, built, and lived within. It was a national act of preparation, carried out garden by garden, street by street, until the entire civilian landscape of Britain was transformed. The war would test these shelters in the most brutal way. Families who doubted their strength would find their lives spared after a near miss. Others would learn the limits of steel and soil, but whether successful or not, the Anderson shelter became the stage for a civilian drama. Nights of fear, mornings of relief, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people adapting to extraordinary times. And it all began not in distant battlefields, but in backyards, where roses once bloomed, and where survival now took root beneath the earth. Sir John Anderson was not a man of stirring speeches or charismatic gestures. He was, above all, a civil servant, methodical, precise, sometimes even cold in demeanour. Born in Edinburgh in 1882, Anderson had built a career in administration, serving in India and later as governor of Bengal. By the late 1930s, as war loomed over Europe, he was appointed Home Secretary, the post that placed him in charge of Britain's civil defence. For many in government, civil defence was a logistical headache, a set of regulations and instructions. For Anderson, it became an obsession. How do you protect millions of people when the enemy's weapon is the sky itself? Anderson's solution reflected both his pragmatism and his limitations. He believed that the most effective defense was not centralized but distributed. Bombers could destroy factories, power stations, even whole districts. But if every family had their own shelter, survival could not be bombed out in one strike. This was why the garden shelter, the small corrugated hut half buried in earth, made sense. It was cheap, mass-producible, and within the grasp of ordinary people to construct. Yet Anderson also knew this would not be popular. Asking families to dig up their gardens, to live in damp holes in the ground, was not a rallying cry. It was a grim necessity. His reputation suffered. Critics called him unimaginative, even indifferent to the human discomfort the shelters created. He rarely defended himself. For him, numbers mattered: how many shelters built, how many lives saved. In the months before the Blitz, the Anderson shelters were often ignored. Families resented the labor of digging. Some used them as tool sheds or chicken coops, reluctant to imagine themselves spending nights underground. But when the raids began in earnest, attitudes changed overnight. Suddenly, Anderson's plan no longer seemed abstract. It was the only option for millions. Londoners discovered that the shelters worked. Though not invulnerable, they drastically reduced casualties from bomb blasts. Reports circulated of families emerging alive from shelters while their houses lay flattened above. Anderson's cold pragmatism now looked like foresight. And yet the shelters also revealed the deep inequalities of wartime Britain. To receive one, a household needed a garden. In crowded tenements and inner-city blocks, families had no such luxury. The poorest citizens were forced into communal shelters or onto the platforms of the London Underground, which became vast dormitories. Photographs of packed platforms, with families sleeping between rails as trains still ran, shocked the world. Many asked, why should the wealthy enjoy private protection while the poor huddled in public spaces? Anderson, ever pragmatic, acknowledged the gap, but offered no perfect solution. His shelters were never meant to solve every problem. They were part of a patchwork, one tool among many in the struggle for survival. Inside the shelters, life was a study in adaptation. Families brought rugs to cover the damp floors, hung curtains to separate spaces, even built wooden bunks to create the semblance of a bedroom. Children decorated walls with drawings. One woman recalled writing her grocery list by candlelight underground, trying to preserve a sense of normality. The shelters were not comfortable, but they became part of routine. Sirens would wail, families would gather their belongings, tea kettles, pillows, sometimes pets, and retreat underground. Hours later they emerged, bleary-eyed, to inspect the damage. For children, it was almost an adventure. For parents, it was a nightly trial. For Anderson, each family that survived was proof of his plan. The press often portrayed the shelters as symbols of stoic British spirit. Photographers captured smiling families waving from their underground huts, tea in hand, as if to say, "We will endure." But diaries and oral histories reveal another side. Many people hated the shelters. They were cramped, airless, and terrifying when bombs fell close. One Londoner wrote, "The walls groaned as if alive. My children cried, and I wondered if the roof above would collapse and bury us all." The truth was both. The shelters inspired both gratitude and resentment, comfort and claustrophobia. They embodied the contradictions of life under the Blitz. Through it all, Sir John Anderson remained in the background. He did not seek to become a national hero. He was not Churchill, with speeches of defiance. He was an administrator. His name carried not in headlines, but in the steel huts buried in backyards. And yet, by the war's end, his shelters had become one of the defining features of Britain's civilian defence. More than 3 million Anderson shelters were installed, protecting millions of lives. They were imperfect, but they worked often enough to matter. Perhaps Anderson's greatest legacy is not in the shelters themselves, but in what they represent: the partnership between government planning and civilian resilience. The government delivered sheets of steel. Civilians turned them into sanctuaries. The line between authority and citizen blurred. It was not just Anderson who built the shelters. It was every father with a shovel, every mother carrying soil, every child who hung a picture on a damp steel wall. Together they built the underground that kept a nation alive. It's one thing to design a shelter and quite another to live in it. The Anderson shelters, handed out in kits of corrugated steel sheets and bolts, became part of daily life in ways no official could have predicted. Families quickly realized that survival was not just a matter of digging a hole and covering it with earth. It was about transforming a damp, metallic structure into a place where life could continue, however fragile. Once the Blitz became routine, so too did the rituals of the shelter. Parents tucked their children into makeshift bunks, quilts piled high against the cold. Candles or hurricane lamps cast dim glows, and the faint smell of paraffin mixed with the earthy dampness of the walls. Many shelters were lined with old carpets or scraps of wood to keep the moisture at bay. Mothers often carried kettles down, determined that even underground, tea would be served. The British obsession with tea, mocked by some, became a lifeline of normality. Children, for their part, adapted faster than adults. They brought toys, books, even pets into the shelters. Games were invented, shadows cast against the walls became entertainment, and the thud of bombs overhead was reinterpreted as the distant rumble of giants or thunder. One child later recalled that she thought the shelter was a sort of secret fort, a place where her family became closer, bound together by routine. What for adults was claustrophobia and dread could, for the young, become an adventure. Yet the adults carried a different burden. Hours spent underground took a toll. Sleep was broken, bodies ached from lying on cold benches, and the constant fear of collapse weighed heavily. Diaries reveal voices full of exhaustion and suppressed despair. We sat listening to the earth tremble, the children trying to sleep, the lamp flickering. I thought, this is not a home. This is a tomb waiting to close. Such words strip away the propaganda of cheerful families waving from shelter doorways. Survival was never glamorous. It was a daily negotiation with fear. Still, the shelters became communal symbols. Neighbors often helped each other dig or reinforce walls, and there was pride in a well-built shelter. In some districts, competitions arose over who could make the most comfortable interior. Wooden paneling, shelves for books, even curtains were added. Some families planted flowers on top of their earth-covered roofs, disguising them as garden mounds. In these small acts of personalization, people reclaimed control over an uncontrollable war. There were also countless stories of shared humanity. When families without gardens sought refuge, others invited them into their shelters, cramming more bodies than the design intended. Elderly neighbors, unable to dig their own shelters, were taken in by younger couples. Acts of kindness proliferated underground, where fear was universal and class distinctions blurred. The Anderson shelters became sites not just of survival, but of solidarity. For all their discomfort, the shelters saved lives. Reports after raids often described the stark contrast. Houses above destroyed, families below crawling out alive. Survivors carried with them a strange gratitude, not only to the steel walls, but to the collective effort that made them habitable. The shelters were no longer just Anderson's design. They were products of civilian ingenuity, each one a reflection of the people inside it. The Blitz tested them mercilessly. Explosions shook the ground, sometimes collapsing entrances, sometimes flooding shelters in heavy rain. Families learned to keep buckets ready for bailing water, spades for clearing debris, ropes for pulling each other out. They improvised because they had no choice. And every morning, when they climbed back into daylight, there was relief, but also dread, knowing they would return again the next night. In this rhythm of descent and emergence, the shelters became extensions of home. They were kitchens, bedrooms, playrooms, and sometimes chapels. People prayed underground, whispered confessions, made promises. Children celebrated birthdays with hastily lit candles. Life insisted on continuing, even beneath the shadow of annihilation. It was this resilience that gave the shelters their true power. Not the steel nor the bolts, but the will of ordinary people to make them livable. The Blitz was not a single night of terror, but a relentless season of fire and ruin. For 57 consecutive nights in the autumn of 1940, Londoners lived in a cycle of daylight recovery and nocturnal descent into darkness. The Anderson shelters, scattered across back gardens like strange metallic mushrooms, were tested again and again under the weight of bombs that turned familiar neighborhoods into wastelands. One night in September, in the district of Stepney, a family of 6 crouched inside their shelter as high-explosive bombs fell nearby. The earth trembled violently, dust poured through the cracks, and the children screamed. The father later recounted how he braced himself against the wall, certain that it would collapse. When silence finally came and they crawled out, their house was gone. The shelter, half buried and misshapen, had held. That night, a family survived not because of chance, but because a simple structure of corrugated steel had absorbed the fury of modern war. Not all stories ended in triumph. In some cases, shelters flooded during heavy rains, trapping families in rising water. In others, entrances collapsed under debris, forcing neighbors to dig furiously to free those inside. A woman in East London recalled pounding against the metal walls, certain no one could hear her above the air raid sirens. It was her neighbor's dog, barking at the ground, that alerted rescuers to dig her out. Such moments revealed both the fragility and the resilience of the system. The shelters were not invincible, but they gave people a fighting chance. Night after night, the shelters became theaters of endurance. Families listened to the drone of Luftwaffe bombers overhead, the whistle of falling bombs, and the distant thuds of anti-aircraft guns. The air seemed alive with menace, every sound amplified by fear. Inside the shelters, conversations often fell silent, broken only by whispered prayers or the rattling of cups in trembling hands. In those hours, civilians experienced war more intimately than many soldiers at the front. Their battlefield was the sky, and their armor was thin steel buried in earth. There were also moments of extraordinary humanity. In Coventry, during the infamous raid of November 14, 1940, when wave after wave of German bombers reduced the medieval city to rubble, shelters were filled beyond capacity. Families pressed shoulder to shoulder, strangers became kin for a night, and when dawn revealed the shattered cathedral and smouldering ruins, survivors emerged together. Many had lost homes, some had lost relatives, but the shelters had preserved their lives. One man later said, "We came out not as neighbors, but as a single family. The shelter bound us together." Government inspectors toured the aftermath of raids, recording which shelters had failed and which had held. Their reports were clinical, filled with measurements and statistics, but behind each entry lay human stories. The failures haunted Sir John Anderson, though he rarely showed it publicly. For every shelter that collapsed, dozens more had protected their occupants. Numbers mattered, but numbers were not lives. Civilians understood this in ways officials never could. For those who survived, gratitude mixed with bitterness. The shelters were both salvation and burden, symbols of resilience and reminders of vulnerability. As the Blitz wore on, routines hardened. Families learned which sounds meant danger and which meant relative safety. Children could sometimes sleep through entire raids, accustomed to the percussion above. Parents became experts in packing essentials, blankets, food, candles, even playing cards to pass the time. There was an odd normality to the absurd, a rhythm of living underground that mirrored life above. The shelter was no longer an intrusion. It was a second home. And through it all, the shelters gained a symbolic power far beyond their physical form. They became emblems of ordinary defiance, proof that civilians would not be broken. Unlike grand speeches or military victories, this defiance was quiet, almost invisible, hidden beneath gardens and backyards. Yet it was there, night after night, in the steady heartbeat of families who endured in silence while the sky fell. When the war finally loosened its grip and the nightly sirens grew less frequent, the Anderson shelters remained, half buried in the soil of Britain's gardens. At first, families were reluctant to dismantle them. They had been more than structures. They had been companions through fear, protectors of children's dreams, witnesses to whispered prayers in the dark. And yet, as peace settled, their purpose dissolved. Some shelters were abandoned to rust, swallowed by weeds and nettles. Others were repurposed as tool sheds, chicken coops, or storage for garden furniture. What had once been the front line of civilian defense slowly became mundane, part of the landscape, unnoticed until one tripped over a corrugated edge sticking from the earth. But for those who had lived inside, the memory lingered. Survivors often spoke of their shelters with a strange mix of affection and dread. One woman recalled years later, "It was damp, cold, and dreadful, but it saved us. I'll never forget the sound of the bombs above, while my children slept below. The shelter was never simply a piece of steel. It was an ark, carrying families through the storm. For many, it symbolized the ordinariness of heroism, the quiet courage of doing whatever was needed to keep life going." Sir John Anderson himself never sought public glory. He continued his political career, later elevated to the peerage as Viscount Waverley. To most Britons, his name faded into the background, yet the shelters that bore his name outlived his public reputation. They became, in their own way, monuments, not grand or marble, but living reminders hidden in gardens and memories. To speak of Anderson shelters was to speak of an entire generation's endurance. The legacy of the shelters extended beyond the war. They reshaped how Britain thought about civil defense, about the role of ordinary people in survival. No longer could civilians be seen as passive bystanders. They had been soldiers in their own way, armed not with rifles but with shovels, blankets, and the stubborn will to endure. The war had blurred the line between battlefield and home, and the Anderson shelters stood as the clearest expression of that transformation. Even decades later, during the Cold War, echoes of Anderson's idea returned. Governments once again considered mass shelters, distributed at the household level, as protection against a new kind of threat. The principle remained. Survival was not only about armies and generals, but about individuals and families making do together. The shelters had written that lesson into Britain's collective memory. Today, a few Anderson shelters survive, preserved in museums or tucked away in gardens where families refuse to dismantle them. Visitors step inside and feel the cramped air, the chill of steel and earth, and perhaps imagine what it was like to wait in darkness while the sky above roared. For those who lived it, no imagination is needed. The memories are etched permanently. The sound of rain on metal, the smell of damp soil, the relief of daylight after a night of terror. The story of the Anderson shelter is not one of triumph or grandeur. It is the story of ordinary people taking what they were given, corrugated iron sheets and bolts, and turning it into life-saving havens. It is the story of families who refused to surrender their humanity, even when reduced to crouching in holes dug in their own gardens. And it is the story of a civil servant, Sir John Anderson, whose uncharismatic but practical vision gave millions the chance to survive. In the end, the true builders of the shelters were not ministers or manufacturers, but the men, women, and children who dug, reinforced, and lived inside them. They made the underground a place of endurance, of community, and of stubborn hope. In the face of destruction from above, they created resilience below. That is the quiet legacy of the Anderson shelters and of the civilians who made them more than steel and earth.